sign here, move in Friday, and leave by the end of 6 months. She slid the papers across the table like she was filing a permit, not proposing a marriage. The contract was 9 pages long. The part I kept coming back to was a single paragraph near the bottom of page 6, written in the kind of language that tries very hard to sound casual. The arrangement concludes on the date specified above. Both parties agree to part without contest, claim, or legal obligation of any kind. Both parties. I remember thinking, she really did think of everything. My name is Nathan Greer. I'm a roofer. I've been doing it for 11 years. Mostly residential, sometimes commercial, out of a small operation in Barrie, Ontario that I run with one full-time guy and whoever's available on weekends. I drive a 2014 Ram with a cracked dashboard and a passenger seat that smells like wood sealant no matter what I do. I have a daughter named Piper who is 7 years old and who, at the time all of this started, was going through a phase where she refused to eat anything that wasn't either orange or round. Carrots, yes. Clementines, yes. Chicken nuggets, only if I used the cookie cutter to make them into circles. That was my life. That was the whole of it, and I want to be clear. I was not unhappy. I met Diane Ellsworth on a Tuesday in October, which is peak season for emergency roof calls in central Ontario, because that's when people realized the summer didn't actually fix anything, it just hit it. I got the call at 6 in the morning. Commercial property, Oro Medante. Flat roof, standing water, possible membrane breach. Straightforward enough that I didn't bring Tyler, just went myself. The property turned out to be the main house on a private estate. The kind of place that has a gate with a camera and a long gravel driveway that makes you feel, without anyone saying a word, that you probably should have worn cleaner boots. I wore my regular boots. I always do. A woman met me at the side entrance. She was maybe 45-50, in a dark coat with her hair pulled back, holding a coffee cup with both hands the way you do when the morning is cold and the coffee is the only thing keeping you anchored to the earth. She introduced herself as Diane. No last name, no title, just Diane. I said, "Nice to meet you." She said the drain was over there. We stood on that roof for 40 minutes while I assessed the damage, and she watched me work. Not in a strange way. In the way of someone who is used to watching people perform tasks and deciding whether those people are competent. At some point, I told her the membrane was fine. The drain housing was cracked, probably from a branch impact during the August storms. Fixable in a day, less if the weather held. She said, "How much?" I gave her my number. She didn't blink. She said, "Can you start Thursday?" I said yes. That should have been the end of it. I should have driven back to Barrie, picked up Piper from my mother's, made something orange and round for dinner, and never thought about Diane Ellsworth again. But Thursday came, and she was on the roof again, watching, and on Friday she brought 2 coffees, and by the following Wednesday, when I was wrapping up the last of the flashing work, she sat down on the low parapet wall and said, without any particular build-up, "I have a proposal for you, and I want you to hear the whole thing before you say anything." I said, "Okay." She told me about the board. Her company, Ellsworth Capital, which I had not Googled until that moment but had a passing awareness of, in the way you're aware of large things you've never had reason to touch, was going through a governance restructuring. There were shareholders who felt, in her words, that her personal instability was a liability. Her last relationship had ended badly and publicly. There was a vote coming in the spring. Her legal team had advised that a demonstrated stable domestic arrangement would, in their words, mitigate perception risk. I want to be honest about what I felt when she said all of that. I didn't feel insulted. I felt the way I feel when someone describes a repair problem, and I can already see 3 places where they've misunderstood what the actual problem is. I felt like I was looking at something from the outside that the person describing it couldn't see clearly. I said, "So, you want to get married?" She said, "Temporarily. Contractually. With appropriate compensation." She named a number. I won't write it here, but I'll tell you it was more than I'd made in the previous 3 years combined. And she wasn't done. There was also a clause about accommodation. I'd move into the east wing of the house with Piper, and another about expenses, and another about public appearances, and the one near the bottom of page 6 that I already told you about. I asked her why me. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You're competent. You're not afraid of me. And you haven't tried to impress me once in the 4 days you've been here." I thought about Piper. about the crack in my truck dashboard, about the fact that my furnace had been making a sound for 2 months that I didn't have the money to diagnose. I said I needed to think about it. She said, "Take the weekend." I talked to my mother first, which tells you something about me. My mother, Gail, is 67 and lives in a bungalow 12 minutes from my place and has strong opinions about most things and keeps them almost entirely to herself, which is a discipline I have always admired and never inherited. I told her the broad strokes. She's listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When I finished, she said, "What does Piper think?" I said I hadn't told Piper. She said, "That's not what I asked." I sat with that for a while. Then I said, "She'd probably think the house was cool." My mother smiled at her coffee cup. She said, "It won't be simple." I said, "Nothing is." She said, "No, but some things are complicated in ways that change you." That's what I mean. I think about that a lot, the way she said it, not as a warning exactly. More like she was handing me something to carry and wanted me to know the weight of it before I took it. We moved in on a Friday, like the contract said. Piper brought her stuffed moose, her library books, and a bag of clementines she insisted on carrying herself. The house had 12 rooms that I counted, and probably more that I didn't. Our end of it had a small kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a sitting room with a window that looked out over a frozen pond. Piper stood in the middle of the sitting room and turned in a slow circle and then looked at me and said, "Dad, is this real?" I said, "For now it is." She thought about that. Then she said, "Okay, I want the room with the pond window." I let her have it. Diane was almost entirely absent those first 2 weeks. That was by design, I think. She ran her company from her office on the 2nd floor, had calls at hours that suggested she was dealing with people in multiple time zones, and appeared at meals. Only when I happened to be in the main kitchen at the same time she was, which occurred rarely. And with the mutual awkwardness of 2 people who have made a practical arrangement and are now confronted with the ordinary reality of sharing a refrigerator. There was a housekeeper, Marguerite, who had worked for Diane for 8 years and who looked at me those first few weeks the way you look at a piece of furniture that someone has moved to an unexpected location. Not unkindly, just evaluating whether it made sense. I tried to stay out of the way. I kept to the East Wing, drove Piper to school in Barrie, came back, did administrative work for the business, drove back to pick her up. Most days I was in bed by 10. Most days Diane was still on calls. The first real conversation we had, not logistics, not scheduling, actual conversation, happened on a Sunday morning in late November. I was at the main kitchen island, making Piper's lunch. Diane came in for coffee and saw what I was doing and said, "What are those?" I said, "Sandwiches. She only eats them if they're cut into circles." There was a pause. Diane said, "With a cookie cutter?" I said, "Yes." She stood there for a moment, watching me press a circular cutter through a cheese sandwich, and I had the very clear sense that she did not know what to do with this information. She said, "Does that work?" I said, "Better than you'd think." She poured her coffee. She didn't leave right away, which was different from usual. She leaned against the counter and watched me make 3 more circle sandwiches, and then she said, "How long has she been with you?" "Full time, I mean," I said. "Since she was 2. Her mother moved to Vancouver, not abruptly. We'd been separating for a while. It just took time to finish. Kezia lives there now, has a good life there. Piper visits in the summer. It works well enough." Diane said, "Does it?" I said, "Most things work well enough if you don't ask too much of them." She looked at me then in a way she hadn't before, not assessing, something else. She said, "I'm going to need you at an event in December, the Meridian Foundation, Gala, black tie." I said, "I don't own a tuxedo." She said, "I'll have one sent." I said, "I can buy my own." She said, "It's a fitted event, the measurements take." I said, "Diane, I can buy my own." The silence was different after that. She put down her coffee cup and said, "All right." She almost smiled. She said, "Greer's Roofing, is the work good?" I said, "It's honest." She said, "That's not what I asked?" I said, "Yes, it's good. I'm good at it." She nodded once. She picked up her coffee and walked out. December was easier than I expected. The gala was a room full of people who knew each other and were pretending not to notice how much, which is a specific kind of exhaustion I was not used to but adapted to quickly, because it turned out being a roofer in a room full of wealth managers meant nobody particularly wanted to engage with me past the initial handshake, which suited me fine. I stood near Diane when proximity was required. I talked to a man from Collingwood who ran a ski resort and had strong opinions about the upcoming federal infrastructure bill. I drank exactly 2 glasses of something that cost more than my truck insurance. At one point, a woman Diane introduced as my board liaison. Sandra pulled Diane aside, and I was left briefly alone near a table of canapes. Sandra kept glancing at me during their conversation. I kept my face neutral and ate a piece of something with salmon on it. On the way home, Diane said, "You did well." I said, "I didn't do much," she said. That was the point. I thought about that for a while. Then I said, "Your board thinks a roofer from Barrie makes you look stable." She said, "They think a man who doesn't need anything from me makes me look stable." I let that sit. Then I said, "Is that true? That I don't need anything from you?" She was quiet for long enough that I stopped expecting an answer. Then she said, "Not in the way people usually do." No, January was cold in the way that Ontario January is cold, which is bone through. Piper had started ice skating lessons at the rink in Aurelia and had taken to it with an intensity that alarmed me slightly and pleased me greatly. I drove her every Saturday morning. I started bringing coffee in a thermos and sitting in the cold rink with the other parents, and occasionally I'd catch myself thinking, "This is fine. This is actually fine." The moment that changed things happened not at the gala or at a board meeting or at any of the points I would have predicted. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon in January when Piper asked to see the rest of the house. I walked with her through the main rooms. She ran her hand along the bookshelves in the library and asked who all the books belonged to, and I said Diane. Mostly, probably. And Piper made a face that meant she was filing this information under things that require further investigation. We ended up in the hallway outside Diane's office, which was closed, and Piper pointed to a framed photograph on the wall. An older man, 60s maybe, in work clothes, standing in front of what looked like a warehouse, smiling like someone had caught him in the middle of a laugh. Piper said, "Who's that?" I said, "I don't know, bud." And then Diane's door opened and she was standing there looking at us. She looked at the photograph. Something moved through her face quickly, the way weather moves through a place that's mostly open. She said, "That's my father. He started the company." Piper said, "He looks nice." Diane said, He was very kind." Piper said, "What was his name?" "Thomas, but he went by Tom." Piper said, "We have a Thomas at my school, but he goes by Thomas. He says Tom sounds like a cat." Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed, not a polite gala laugh. An actual one, unexpected, that surprised her as much as it surprised me. She looked at Piper and then at me and then back at Piper and said, "Would you like to come in? I have a better photograph. One from before the company." Piper looked at me. I nodded. We sat in Diane's office for an hour. Diane showed Piper photographs of her father in the early days, a man who had started with a single small trucking company in Sudbury and grown it into something that occupied 3 floors of a downtown Toronto building. Piper asked questions that I would not have thought to ask, and Diane answered them with more patience than I had ever seen her use with anyone. When we left, Piper took my hand in the hallway and said, quietly, "Dad, I think she's lonely." I said, "Why do you say that?" she said. "Because she has a lot of pictures of the same person." I was wrong about Diane in some specific ways that I think are worth naming. I had assumed the arrangement would be easy to stay outside of. I had assumed I could treat it the way I treat working in someone else's home. You're there, you're present, you do the job, you go home. I'd gotten very good at that over the years. The professional distance that lets you enter someone's most private space and not take anything from it. But Diane was not a job site. She was a person who had been managing herself for so long that she'd gotten very good at not being seen. And somewhere around February, she stopped managing quite as hard when I was in the room. It started small. She started eating dinner at the same time as us instead of after. She started asking Piper about skating. One Saturday, she drove with us to Aurelia and sat in the rink with her coffee and her laptop, and I noticed she didn't open the laptop once. She told me, one evening in the kitchen, that her father had taught her to read financial statements at the same kitchen table where he did her homework with her, that he had been a welder before he was a businessman, that the warehouse in the photograph was the first property he'd ever owned, and that he'd paid it off in 7 years while raising her and her sister alone. I said, "Your mother?" She said, "She left when I was 8. I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Don't be. He was enough." And then she looked at me in a way that I had learned to recognize by then. A way that meant she was about to say something that she hadn't planned to say. She said, "You remind me of him, not in how you look, in how you move through a space. Like you know what the space is for, and you're not confused by it." I didn't know what said thank you. She said, "It's not a compliment, it's an observation." But she was smiling when she said it. March. I want to get the March part right because it's the part I've gone over most in the years since. The contract was set to end in mid-April. We were both aware of this in the way you're aware of a sound you keep not quite hearing. We didn't talk about it directly. We talked around it. Diane mentioned once that her board meeting had gone well. I mentioned once that I'd been looking at a small property in Innisfil that might work for expanding the business, but things had gotten easy between us in a way I hadn't anticipated and didn't know what to do with. Easy in the way of two people who have stopped performing for each other. I knew how she took her coffee. She knew that I wouldn't make a decision about something until I'd walked away from it for at least a day. I knew that she went quiet when she was worried and got precise when she was hurt. She knew that I said things were fine when they weren't, and she'd learned to wait it out. Piper had stopped thinking of the house as a temporary thing somewhere around February. I noticed it when she started bringing friends home from school. That's how kids mark territory. They share it. One evening in March, Piper was in bed and I was in the sitting room with the pond window, reading. Diane knocked. She never came to the East Wing in the evenings. She sat down across from me and she said, "I need to tell you something." I put the book down. She said, "The board situation has resolved. The vote went fine. There's no longer a practical reason for the arrangement to continue." I said, "I know." She said, "I wanted you to hear it from me directly rather than from the legal summary." I said, "I appreciate that." There was a long quiet. Outside, the pond was starting to show dark patches where the ice was thinking about melting. Not yet, but thinking. She said, "Piper would miss the skating rink in Aurelia." I said, "There are rinks in Barrie." She said, "Yes." Another quiet, longer. I said, "Diane?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Is there something you actually want to say?" Then she looked at me. She said, "I think I'd like you to stay." Not because of the board. Not because of any practical reason. I'm aware of how that sounds given the nature of what we agreed to. I'm aware you have a life that doesn't require this, I'm aware. I said, "Stop explaining it." She stopped. I said, "You've been explaining things your whole life. You don't have to explain this one." She was quiet for a moment, then she said very simply, "I don't want you to go." I sat with that. I looked out at the pond. I thought about the cookie cutter. I thought about Piper asking what Tom sounded like. I thought about Diane in the rink with the laptop she didn't open. Then I said, "I'm going to need a workspace on the property. Somewhere I can keep tools, run quotes, do billing. Not the garage, I need it separate from the house." She said, "There's a building past the north fence that used to be an equipment shed. You could convert it," I said. "I'd want to do the work myself." She said, "Obviously." I said, "And Piper gets to keep the pond room." She said, "I've never once tried to take it from her." I said, "I know. I want to say something honest, which is that I don't know exactly when I stopped thinking of it as an arrangement and started thinking of it as a life. I don't think there was a single moment. I think it accumulated the way snow accumulates, not dramatically, not all at once, just quietly, until one morning you look outside and everything looks different, and you realize it's been different for a while and you just hadn't named it yet. The equipment shed took me 6 weekends to convert. Diane brought coffee on the 3rd weekend and stayed for 2 hours asking questions about the work. Piper helped me paint the interior walls a color she described as the inside of a cloud. The board approved Diane's performance review without issue that spring. She told me in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, the way she'd told me all the things that mattered. Without ceremony. Looking at something other than my face. I said, "That's good." She said, "Yes." I said, "You're not going to say you told you so?" She said, "I told you so" would imply I had doubts. I had no doubts. And there it was, that precise thing, that thing she did when she was most herself, when she'd stopped managing. I think what I want to say to whoever is listening is this. I went into that house as a function, the way a good contractor goes into a job, competent, boundaried, ready to leave when the work is done. I thought I knew what the work was. I didn't know about the photograph in the hallway. I didn't know about the coffee in the rink. I didn't know that Piper would see something in 45 minutes that took me months. The pond is fully thawed now. Piper has graduated from the rink in Aurelia to the outdoor ice on our end of the property when it's cold enough, which in Ontario is, I promise you, plenty often. She and Diane skate on Sunday mornings while I make breakfast. I make things in circles now, mostly out of habit. I stopped needing the cutter a while ago. Some things become ordinary. That's not the sad version of the story. That's the good one.